The Rebel Alliance in Star Wars was attempting to reform the Galactic Republic, but there's a few key ways in which their organization didn't match up with the Republic which they were trying to restore. Today we're going to talk about why the Rebellion didn't try to run a Senate before Endor. The formation of the Rebel Alliance was a long and somewhat painful process. Although central leadership was provided by senators like Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and Garmbal Iblis, the raw power of the Imperial military meant a lot of rebel organization and also military action had to happen on the more local levels, enacted by what the Alliance termed sector forces, although they didn't often match up with astrographic sectors especially closely. The looseness of the term is part of why the Essential Guide to Warfare calls it more politics than reality, saying, quote, "Some sectors were home to dozens of different rebel groups, while others heard barely a whisper of dissent against the Emperor's rule. In principle, sector forces belong to the local governments supporting the Alliance, known as Alliance Commands, but the High Command claimed supreme military authority over them, and used its resources to create extra sector forces where no friendly government existed," end quote. So there was also a more centralized Alliance fleet on top of this, with resources often requested or passed in either direction, a common source of friction which would mirror later conflicts arising within the New Republic between powers over local and central military forces. This was one of the central causes of the Second Galactic Civil War 4 decades after the Battle of Yavin, where Corellia led a revolt against the Galactic Alliance. The rebellion, unlike the CIS, did not decide to establish their own full government structure in opposition to the Empire. They had a chief of state in Mon Mothma who was unelected and had largely unlimited executive power, but they lacked the same political institutions the Republic or even the CIS had, like their own Senate. It was often suggested that the rebels should try to like this video and subscribe for more, as well as institute their own galactic government. But the biggest reason they didn't largely comes down to the importance of appearance to the Rebel Alliance and the concept of political legitimacy. Mon Mothma argued that, while the ultimate goal of the rebellion was to establish a democratic government, there were several issues with following the model of the CIS and establishing a separate one right away. For one thing, the CIS parliament was largely ineffectual, and that would be the same with a potential rebel senate in exile. The Rebel Alliance largely didn't openly govern planets, since any planet openly throwing off Imperial rule would be quickly crushed by the Empire's far superior military. Operation Domino in 2BBY saw the rebels try to organize mass uprisings to throw Imperial control off of entire worlds or sectors. But while some planets did manage to escape Imperial rule this way, notably Mon Calamari, most of the so-called secession worlds were brought quickly and brutally back into line. So their ability to effectively organize and enact any kind of domestic policy would therefore be limited, and even for governments which were secretly aligned with the Rebel Alliance, they couldn't have any kind of policy that would betray that. Primarily though, Mon Mothma wanted to avoid the perception that the Rebel Alliance was simply another iteration of the CIS. Because they're the two consecutive rebel movements in the galaxy, the rebels sometimes do get conflated even out of universe with the CIS. But it's important to remember that the means and motives of the groups were pretty diametrically opposed. Even though there were some CIS remnant groups that joined or allied with the rebels, this required them to renounce their separatist ambitions generally. I've done a separate video on the specific relationships between the CIS holdouts and the Rebel Alliance before, but the rebels were always very cognizant of the fact that they needed to avoid being associated with the CIS if they wanted to succeed. And that meant it had to look like they weren't trying to secede. The rebellion was intended to restore the Republic in its pre-imperial form after all, whereas the CIS had intended to break off and form a separate government entirely from that pre-imperial form. The Rebel Alliance was made up of many loyalists who fought the CIS in the Clone Wars just as fiercely as the later Palpatine loyalists did. Rebel High Command and political leadership were each composed far more of Imperial defectors than former Separatists. By setting up a full government in exile, the Alliance would be playing towards two primary connected problems. One was that, with the Alliance set up as a full separate government, Palpatine would be able to draw those comparisons to the CIS, that they were setting the galaxy ablaze in another war, trying to take down or tear apart the Empire as a whole, which was the legitimate successor as he was trying to portray it, to the Republic. The rebellion, for their part, would rather portray it as just trying to take down Palpatine and his installed power base as an illegitimate ruler of a perverse version of the Republic. From that, we can see the second part. By setting up an alternative government, Mon Mothma and the Rebel High Command would be to some extent acknowledging Palpatine and the Empire as a legitimate ruling body. Within the context of the rebellion, Mon Mothma was effectively intended to be the legitimate Republic Chief of State, albeit with emergency powers that were set to terminate when Palpatine was deposed, rather than ruling in parallel to him as another galactic leader. The Imperial Senate under this view essentially was the Rebel Senate, where the Alliance was largely fighting to restore its power and remove the political sycophants of the Emperor, like the Moffs and Governors, who prevented the Senate from doing its job and removed the Senate's power as the legitimate representatives of the galaxy's inhabitants. This is the capacity we see some like Bail Organa operating in when they remained in the Senate, while also leading the rebellion in secret, although some like Mon Mothma and Garbal Iblis were forced to leave the Senate when attempts to capture and potentially execute them as militant dissidents were made. All of these factors and motivations for both the rebellion and the Empire reflect sociologist Max Weber's 3 types of legitimacy from his work Politics as a Vocation. They're a bit antiquated, but they're a good place for us to briefly touch on for a basic understanding of legitimacy and how it operates. These 3 types of legitimacy are the kind that stem from tradition as the first one, where a type of rule is accepted because of historical precedent, the charismatic second, where a leader is able to maintain power because of their own personal traits, and then third, a rational legal framework, where legitimacy is derived from a system of laws being followed. All of these, at their core, involve people buying into the system, though. As Weber puts it, the relationship between the governed and the governor is based on the legitimate use of force, that is to say, force that is perceived as legitimate, perceived being the operating term. So you become the legitimate ruler by convincing people that you are the legitimate ruler, and those are 3 pathways you can follow to do that. So for the rebellion, being able to put themselves forward as a legitimate government and grow their support at least partially came down to highlighting differences between themselves and the specter of the droid armies that came before them as rebels and separatists, which the galaxy still hadn't recovered from. Palpatine grew his own legitimacy not just through the obvious charismatic vein, but through positioning himself in the oppressive institutions of the Empire, many of which he enacted under the Republic, as being just a response to the CIS attempts to demolish the tradition and rational legal framework which existed before, as the basis for the Republic's legitimacy. So each side was trying to position themselves as being the legitimate inheritors to the Republic's legitimacy. The rebels needed to be seen as fighting for what was good in the Republic and preventing Palpatine from destroying that, rather than being seen as opposing the core institutions of the Republic that then transitioned into the Empire. Palpatine's political strategy in undermining the rebellion required painting them as a further break in tradition and a group which was trying to undermine that rational legal framework. Each side was trying to lay as strong of a claim to those traditions and the historical legal framework as they could. This, of course, isn't to say that those things couldn't be reinterpreted and recontextualized for different political purposes as they went. As we talked about in the Fascism in the Empire video, the supporters of high human culture were trying to kind of reinterpret that framework and that history as being something that supported their particular viewpoint. With all of that in mind, the Rebel High Command was, in a sense, as close to a government in exile as they could realistically plan to become. There were, of course, downsides to this. They weren't able to paint themselves as necessarily living up to the ideals of democracy that they wanted to kind of portray. Even allies like Garbal Iblis were concerned about Mon Mothma's position as a quasi-dictator. And this was often the subject of Imperial propaganda during the rebellion. You could also argue that while these were the reasons for them not to want to form a Senate, that they might have actually been better served optically if they had done so. Especially after the Senate was disbanded, there's an argument to make that they could have formed a Senate in exile, even one without power, that could have allowed them to still portray themselves as being a continuation of that Republic Senate. And that might even have made a stronger case for them as inheriting that Republic tradition. But I'll leave that for you to fight over in the comments, where you can also leave suggestions for future topics that you'd like to see covered on the channel. Either way, that's going to do it for today. Thank you for watching. Remember to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed the video, and I hope to see you next time.